If you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all the other shallow things will not matter. Those powerful words were from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His is an image that looms large over the civil rights movement, and for good reason. A young man, learned, and an indefatigable defender of the dignity of humanity. Without question, his was a life of achievement and greatness. But today, his life isn't the focus. In fact, he's the antagonist of sorts. I'm Alexander Holmes, and this is Moments in a Black Life. By now, everyone, even those under a rock, know that Dr. King was a giant in the civil rights movement. From having steered the boat of civil disobedience in Montgomery to the safe shores of a victorious bus boycott, to successfully pressuring the government for the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. He was a black messiah of sorts. But for every messianic figure, there's always a Judas. While there were a few, one name sticks out the most. The man was indeed a success, a power broker, and a player on the big stage of American politics. Mind you, his storied career was during the 60s and 70s, and he was by no measure a light bright. In fact, his entire backstory is pretty impressive. Humble beginnings, well, sort of. His father had his own business, and they weren't exactly eating red clay. He and his siblings grew up in Glen Cove, New York, the nice, lily-white suburb in Long Island. For Dr. Pierce's portion, he would go on to Cornell University, served his country during the Second Great War, and came home to a JD. That means he was essentially a lawyer. He received that in '49 and quickly went on to become a New York City district attorney. In '52, he received his master's from NYU's law school. So he was no slouch. Now, just to speed things up a bit, between '55 and '77, he occupied spaces ranging from assistant to the Undersecretary of Labor. He helped found Freedom National Bank in Harlem, and he was general counsel of the Treasury Department. He even was a member of the team that successfully represented Dr. King in the U.S. Supreme Court case New York Times v. Sullivan, which I suppose would have lended him more credibility to black citizens as someone down for the cause of civil rights. And with all these accomplishments, you'd probably be expecting me to say that he hadn't actually achieved anything. Well, that just isn't the case. As far as I can see, he was an academician who, outside of his time at HUD, was known by his colleagues as an active contributor to the task at hand. What I can say is that in politics, he was thought of as a tool. William C. Sullivan, one of Hoover's right-hand men, shares in his book, The Bureau, My 30 Years in Hoover's FBI. I suggested to Hoover that we recommend to the NAACP that another man be chosen as successor to King. He goes on to say, my memo fed Hoover the rhetoric about King required in all matters relating to him. He also shares that he named Dr. Samuel Pierce as that successor. It was a fight from the beginning. Hoover used whatever tools he could to find to denigrate the name and remove the credibility of Dr. King. Why? I'll posit because Dr. King was effective and uncontrollable. It began with wiretaps in his home and hotels. Those wiretaps culminated in an anonymous letter to Dr. King suggesting he kill himself with tapes of his extramarital affair. Consider that the famed photographer Ernest Withers was an FBI informant, known to Dr. King. Take that how you will. He reported on the goings-on to the FBI as an insider. To what extent was his information actionable? I can't tell you. But the FBI had a black plant in the organization. Here's the point. As we come out of another Dr. King Day, which the great white hope Ronald Reagan reluctantly signed into reality as a national holiday, blacks can achieve. The African American, but really the African in any part of the diaspora, is extremely capable. But during the construction phase of life, one must also be aware of the foxes attempting to spoil the vine. As greatness is attempted, there will always be those who attempt to destroy what's being developed, be that from outside racism to the duplicity of independent thought. We've seen this with the relationship of Marcus Garvey, a Pan-Africanist, and Booker T. Washington, a pragmatic incrementalist, and the intellectual and lofty W.E.B. Du Bois with his talented 10th. All these were great black servants of the greater civil rights movement, each from their own vantage point, sculpted by their experience and life cultures. But because they couldn't see the greater picture of black liberation and flourishing, their independent thought didn't allow them and their followers to coalesce. But since we're discussing Dr. King, take into consideration the two biggest names in the civil rights movement, Dr. King and Minister Malcolm X. Again, two great men who for the longest time weren't able to work together toward the common goal of black liberation and flourishing because of perspectives. As far as we know, Dr. Pierce wasn't called upon to usurp Dr. King's leadership position, but he was a part of something more dastardly. His final hurrah with American politics would be in the Reagan White House, and for all 8 years, mind you, and as the only black cabinet member in his administration. Can we say token? That's not too harsh, as even his boss, Ronald Reagan, called him a mayor in one meeting, thereby showing that he hadn't even known the only black person serving in a cabinet-level capacity. All the scandals of the Reagan presidency, or the blatant dog whistling to racists during his campaign, didn't scare off Dr. Pierce, the dud at HUD, or Silent Sam, as his executive branch colleagues so affectionately called him. He was used as a bone tossed to black Americans during the Reagan years, not putting up any resistance to the dismantling of low-income housing assistance from HUD. But he did get caught up in what Ronald Reagan is famous for, scandal. It just so happened to be the state cutting housing funding to poor people, while HUD was funneling great gobs of money to Republican insiders who, until present, have yet to show proof of using those monies to produce affordable or rehabbed affordable housing, which was, after all, what the money was for. His reputation was destroyed because of his "yes'm sir" attitude, which was no doubt the reason he was floated as a replacement for Dr. King. In short, it appears they thought he would be a yes man, malleable, and not so much a firebrand. Dr. King is well known in the annals of history for his bold-faced position in the civil rights movement. He deployed every tactic at his disposal, from youth organizing and demonstrating against discrimination to the masterful use of the press and Southern arrogance in heavily bigoted areas. He associated with those who had ties to the Communist Party and was dogged with his pressure on the federal government to act in accordance with the lofty platitudes in the Constitution. But Pierce would have been different. One story recounts that when he was running for a judgeship, he'd already been appointed to, by the way, he failed to speak to power brokers when he had them all in an elevator, but was quick to speak to a homeless person who wasn't going to vote, more than likely, and even if he was, certainly not for a black Republican. As we continue to uncover black success in spite of the odds, just remember that black success is certainly attacked from the outside, but also subtly laid siege to from within. Thanks for listening. This week's episode was produced and hosted by me, Alexander Holmes, with special consideration for research given to What Really Happened Between J. Edgar Hoover and MLK Jr. of TheAtlantic.com, Why the FBI Saw Martin Luther King Jr. as a Communist Threat of History.com, Documentary exposes how the FBI tried to destroy MLK with wiretaps, blackmail of NPR.org, Samuel R. Pierce Jr., ex-housing secretary, dies at 78, of NewYorkTimes.com. HUD Secretary Samuel Pierce Jr., 78, dies, of WashingtonPost.com. And FBI once planned to push Pierce as rival to King. Young New York lawyer was viewed as more pliable black leader, of LATimes.com. Please rate and review the pod on Apple Music and iTunes. It really helps get the word out. And since you like what's happening here, please follow on the gram at A Black Life, watch on YouTube at A Black Life Podcast, and share it with friends. Next week, another great story about a black life.